think about leadership transparency, what comes to mind? Do you think of your experience with leaders? Do you think of yourself and your challenge with it? Have you been burned by it? Have you been inspired by it? Or do you think about people at all? Like, is it more of an idea or a concept, the idea of transparency, or even transparency in organization, than it is something personal? Is it more of a 5 reasons leaders should be transparent kind of thought that crosses your mind? If we are to do whole and intentional leader development well for ourselves and for others, I want to suggest that transparency, as much as any topic related to leadership, is deeply personal. And until we think about it that way, we will always miss the experience of an actual human being working toward it. And when you imagine a leader, yourself or someone else, as transparent, I come back to that. What do you think about? And why are your thoughts about it important today? I'm Dr. Rob McKenna, and welcome to the Wild Conversation, where we make the best thinking in psychology, leadership, and organizational science accessible to leaders who are willing to learn and edit for their sake and for the sake of others. And today we are continuing this series we've been doing on risky leadership topics, and specifically today, transparency, if you didn't guess that already. And we have already talked about compassion, generosity. Well, Dr. Halleck broke down generosity recently, and this week, transparency. And then next time, a big one, sacrifice. Like, try to do that, wrap that up in an hour. So we're going to go there. But what in the world does transparency have to do with whole leader development? And why in the world is this a risky leadership topic? Like, why would we put that in a series on risky leadership topics? And quite honestly, transparency, when it's not taken personally, I don't believe it's risky at all. But as soon as we consider the possibility of real transparency for ourselves, we begin to understand the risk. As a kid, some of you know this, I grew up, my dad was a career university president. That's what he did. And so I have a lot of history around leadership stuff and growing up in a family like that. But quite literally, I grew up in a house where a 6-story dorm looked down into my bedroom window. So I kind of literally feel like I grew up in a glass house. At one point, I got to tell you, when I think I was in 4th or 5th grade, someone who did not like my parents threw a cinder block through my bedroom window at about 2 a.m. in the morning. And so that happened multiple times through a season where people were throwing rocks through our windows and shattering these giant windows. So as a kid, you can imagine, like, this whole idea of transparency, like, means something to me. And if I have my own history. So leadership transparency has a history with me that goes way back to my childhood. And it's not just about bricks through windows. But today I have 2 windows, okay, in my house, in my bedroom, that look out at a partial awesome view of Lake Washington. I live in Kirkland, Washington. Look out at this park and see part of the lake, and across, I can even see on a day, certain days, I can see Husky Stadium across the lake. And when we bought our house, honestly, I wasn't that excited about the house, but when I got to the bedroom, I realized I could see a peek at Lake Washington. Even on a cold winter day, when this giant walnut tree, all the leaves have dropped, I can see the Olympic Mountains off in the distance. And so I'm like, I never had a view like that, even just a peek of it. And so I was kind of awesome. So I was pretty psyched about that, back when we bought our house 20 years ago. And today, that view looks a little different. And let me tell you why. 2 of the windows in our bedroom have failed. So that moisture has gotten between the window panes. And that view is no longer as clear as it was 20 years ago. And quite honestly, it's gotten pretty bad, which my wife is not happy about, nor am I. But we have other issues. They are no longer transparent. It looks ridiculous. If you walk into our bedroom window, it's like you are looking through a total fog. And even though the mountains are there and just as grand as ever, and even though my eyes are still, I still have, like, when it comes to my distance, like 20/20 vision, so I see pretty well. The view of the mountains and that stadium is no longer clear. It is anything but that. And it's no longer as transparent as it used to be. And there are more reasons than you want to know regarding why it's happening and why I haven't fixed it. But basically, there's a couple of things going on. One, that we have a certain kind of window. They were wood windows that they built into this house 40 years ago. So they're kind of expensive to replace. And then if you replace some of them, it's kind of weird when you've got some windows that are different than others. And we did a remodel a few years back. And so on part of the house, so the person who did the design built these, they wrapped the windows in these really cool, and it wasn't that cheap, like good wrapped windows. And so we had window people come out, and it's like, it's too expensive to actually, they'd have to rip it all out, all this stuff we had done. So we had a variety of reasons we haven't fixed those windows, but we eventually probably have to fix all the windows in the house. It's a slippery slope, people. And there are other things more pressing, more financially pressing than whether or not I can see Husky Stadium off in the distance. And in the same way, okay, I want to suggest to you that there are a lot of reasons that transparency is not only difficult, but risky. It's complex. So what is transparency? You all know, if anybody who know me, you know that I like to define constructs as I say it. Let's talk about what we're talking about, people. What is transparency? Here's a little bit of a definition. Having the property of transmitting light without appreciable scattering so that the bodies lying beyond are seen clearly. There's actually a word, pellucid, that's related to this. Isn't that interesting? The property of transmitting light. Transparency has something to do with light. Another thing, fine or sheer enough to be seen through. Here's the big word, diaphanous. Fine or sheer enough to be seen through. Free from pretense or deceit. Transparency. Easily detected or seen through. Readily understood. These are all pieces of this transparency definition. Here's another one, characterized by visibility or accessibility of information, especially concerning business practices. Interesting, right? Interesting to think about all those different pieces of the transparency definition bubble. But I'll tell you this, how is transparency commonly thought of? Because if you go read an article, they're probably not going to start with this. Before I write my article about leadership transparency in this famous magazine, let me define transparency as having the property of transmitting light without appreciable scattering so that bodies lying beyond are seen clearly. Like, it doesn't start that way. Most articles you read, and I read a bunch of them preparing for this, don't even define what it is. They just go straight to, this is why we need more of it. And I don't know, y'all. I think that is reckless. I think it's reckless. If we don't talk about what this really is, how in the world do we have any business prescribing it? I felt convicted all of a sudden. I don't know by that. So it's like, how in the world do we have any business? One of the major articles that I did read, published on the topic that shall remain unnamed, author shall remain unnamed, but is similar to most other research searches I found out there on people that a lot of people would read. Here's what you find. Like, one person said this. So we're all living during a time when people want and expect their leaders to be more human, less perfect, and at times a bit vulnerable, regardless of hierarchy or rank. I'm sorry. I'm just, people threw bricks through my window as a kid. Here's why that's important according to this. 5 reasons. This is why transparency is a must. Problems are solved faster. Teams are built easier. Relationships grow authentically. Do I have a voice for radio? People begin to promote trust in their leader. High levels of performance emerge. And then a great and powerful formula emerges. Efficient problem solving plus the ability to build teams easier plus the development of authentic relationships plus trust equals higher levels of performance. So let's get transparent leaders. Let's do this thing. It's really that simple. Unfortunately, and I'm quoting right now. Sorry. And I'm sorry. There's some good stuff in here. So please, it's just for effect, right? This goes on to say, it's really that simple. Unfortunately, the lack of transparency that still exists among leaders in the workplace can potentially put one of these powerful factors at risk, which leads to less optimal levels of performance. The irony is that in the end, it's the leader that loses when performance wanes. Okay, now I'm inspired. I'm going to go be transparent everywhere. I'm just saying, okay, somebody who actually, I don't even know who wrote all that, but I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. I know that. But because there is some good stuff in there, and my voice didn't help. It's funny how voice can affect how you hear something, right? But there's more that went on to that. But this is some of my thought. If it's so obviously and apparent and really that simple, then why isn't everyone doing it all the time? Why aren't we doing all transparency in leadership in its very essence? The act of it is the act. This was something I wrote down as I was thinking this week. It's the act of participating in wholeness. Like, it's important. I get that, being seen as whole and seeing whole. It's the process of seeing clearly and being seen clearly. And it's interesting, right? It is not, we think of transparency as does the leader share everything? Can we see everything the leader is doing? Can we see everything the organization is doing? But isn't it interesting that the true meaning of transparency is both about being seen and seeing? Do we see well? Are we looking through a clouded window? And if so, what do we do about that? And one thing this calls out is that transparency is inherently relational. It's inherently relational. It's about you and it's about me. And for leaders, what does this process involve? It's been such a difficult topic. I got to tell you all, to be honest, for me this week, because if it's going to be whole, it had to be personal for me. And in spirits of transparency, I have struggled with this. I've thought intentionally about what do I share, what don't I share, and I'm not going to, there's not a lot I'm going to share that you're going to be surprised by, but I would tell you that just preparing for this is introduced, just even looking at the definition, introduced the complexity of this and the complexity of my own history regarding it and trying to work on it myself. I've been what I've perceived as transparent, and people have used it for other purposes. I think that's been true. It has required a lot of work. It has involved moments where I have overshared, undershared, and moments where I was misunderstood for what I shared. It's been powerful. It even happened last night in a conversation with my sister and my dad, a slight misunderstanding, but an important slight, for me, misunderstanding. Transparency is the process of seeing and being seen clearly. And that is an incredible and overwhelmingly risky, I think. So all I'm going to do is what I decided to do is I wrote down my 10 tenets of transparency. May sound familiar to some of you, but I didn't know how else to process this. So here we go. And what I would encourage you as you hear these things is maybe grab onto one of them and talk with someone about them. And like, there's something in this you think is important for you, then grab onto that. Here's number one. Transparency involves light. And light is interesting. This is a whole nother talk that I've done in the past, but light is most often intentionally inserted. Without light being intentionally inserted or let in, we default to darkness or seeing less well. Letting light in or turning on the lights, seeing something I have not seen before, is interesting. I made a comment to a family member who's dealing with some really hard things, and I sent this text to them, and I said, I don't know where this came from, but I just said, brokenness invites brokenness. And this is a person dealing with some incredibly difficult things right now. And I said, redemption invites redemption. And this is what he said back to me. I'm not going to unpack this. Some of you are going to go here. I'm just going to tell you what he said. It was profound for me. He said, and if we don't ever get moments of being broken, then how does the light get in? And he went on to say, firmly believe we were meant to be broken, as that's the only way any light can find its way into our minds, souls, and hearts. I'm not going to go into, there's a lot there. Number two, transparency must include an important question. And the question is this: do I see clearly enough? seeing it clearly, driving towards clarity within. There's a question in that, a question, a choice. Before I was talking to my dad about this because he navigated some really difficult leadership situations over his career. He's 93 now. And he said this, he said, one of the things he said that was important, because I was just unpacking this talk today. And he said, before I reveal, I must see. His point about questioning whether or not I'm seeing clearly as a leader. Isn't that interesting? Am I seeing it clearly? And I don't know. I could give you the 3 ways to see clearly, but I just want to open up that conversation. Number 3, transparency is different than vulnerability, but it's related. I'm certainly one of the risks of transparency, like to be seen clearly and to see clearly, is that it can make you vulnerable, and often does. As I've said before, vulnerability is defined as an openness to being hurt. That's what it is. When we tell a leader to be vulnerable, we are telling them quite literally, I don't know if this is what we always mean, be open to being hurt. And sometimes we confuse transparency with vulnerability, right? But I think being seen is a moment where it is a risk. It is a risk. Number 4, this is kind of interesting to think about. Transparency is different than oversharing. You know what I'm saying? Like, oversharing can be a compulsion driven by anxiety and not clarity. Transparency is usually different than that. It's, you know what, so just unpack that maybe for a moment. Like, just think about that. It's different than oversharing, because some people share a bunch, right? And you're like, it didn't feel particularly transparent. It just felt like you had a compulsion to tell me stories about people I don't know for the last hour. I'm just saying, like, and sometimes those are important stories and sometimes they're not relevant, right? Number 5, it's both interpersonal and yet deeply personal. And I think that's where I think, like, if we're to be really clear about what we're talking about, I keep coming back to this. Like, I thought about this so much this week, about that it's not just about being seen. It's about seeing. Isn't that amazingly whole? Like, it's about, I'm looking through a glass of people. My wife and I shut the shades when we go to bed at night because our neighbor's bedroom window looks straight into our bedroom window. And so I'm like, I just don't want to have people watch me sleep. You know what I mean? So it's like making a choice about when to shut those, even though they probably couldn't see anyway because my windows are so fogged up. It's interesting, right? Number 6, different leaders have different issues. See the nuance in this. Every person on your team has different issues. Some struggle with transparency because of the risk that it's inappropriate to be seen as whole in their organizational context. Others compulsively share too much without regard to their own health and compulsion to share. Those are just 2 examples. You probably have 100 other examples that you're thinking of about, yeah, we have different issues. Not everybody had cinder blocks thrown through their window as children. You know, so I think we have different issues that are important for us to understand. Number 7, motive and intent matters. It's another thing that my dad said. He said, when I just asked him, I said, Dad, tell me some things. When you think of transparency, and he said, I think motive and intent matters. Sometimes I've coached leaders who have been in moments where they were seeking to be truthful, but there are also moments, if we're honest, where our transparency can be vengeful at its worst. Like, would you share something to use something against someone else? And I think even this motive of being clear about, there are times when transparency is difficult because as a leader, now you are responsible for solidarity with each one of your team members. And so you can't share everything. There would be an ethical dilemma if you were to share everything about everybody else. Like, so solidarity in that relational piece is interesting, because that's my number 8. It involves, it's this thing, it's relational, but it's also something that's occurring within me. It's something that's occurring in my relationship to you, but sometimes it's also occurring in my relationship to my environment. Like, when it comes to me sharing, for example, the context of organizational decisions that relate to me personally. So for example, whether you share salaries with everybody, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like now you've got solidarity with individuals regarding their salaries, but it's like this whole thing, there's conversation there. Number 9, transparency is a choice. Transparency is a choice in its best form. It's discretionary. If one of you has a child with mental health, are you supposed to share that with everybody? Maybe, maybe not, right? It's a choice. Because by very nature, it's transparency is this unveiling process. I'm lifting the veil on certain things. And so there's certain things that may be appropriate at different times. Number 10, honesty about the process versus honesty about what you can share. It's very interesting. I think this is where the tension comes in. It's like, it's one thing for us to, even when we say just to our teams, I want to be honest with you about, I'm not going to tell you everything, but here are the things that I will share with you. You risk something because there is a risk and the possibility that you even being honest about the process of your sharing, that someone may say, well, what else are you holding back? You know what I mean? So it's a risk, but but that deep discernment. So I think I lay out those points to maybe, again, as I said, maybe there's something in there that's powerful for you to continue a conversation, because my job isn't to answer all this. I would suggest this. Transparency, both seeing more clearly and being seen more clearly, is an organizational necessity regarding the choice to do it and when. It's something that we must talk about if we're to move forward toward wholeness. It doesn't mean it must be done all the time, but I think we have to talk about it and aspire to more healthy levels of transparency. So let's keep the conversation going.